December 1916. A group of desperate aristocrats decided the only way to save the Russian Empire was to kill one man. They fed him cyanide, which he ate like bread. They shot him, and he stood back up. It took the freezing waters of a dark river to finally put him down. Because of this bizarre refusal to die, history remembers Grigory Rasputin as a monster, the mad monk whose dark magic brought a massive global superpower to its knees. But that version of events gives him too much credit. Rasputin didn't destroy Russia. He simply walked into a room that was already empty. His unchecked influence was the inevitable byproduct of a failing state, the final, desperate gasp of an empire already in terminal decline. Long before Rasputin arrived in St. Petersburg, the Russian Empire was cracking under its own weight. Millions of peasants were living in extreme, freezing poverty, completely left behind by the modernizing world. Meanwhile, the ruling Romanov dynasty insulated themselves inside the golden walls of the Winter Palace. They were entirely disconnected from the starvation in the streets outside. Yet all of that immense wealth and military might was rendered useless by a single, terrifying biological reality. The sole heir to the throne was bleeding internally from hemophilia, a disease with no known cure. The greatest doctors in Europe were brought in, and all of them failed. This medical dead end created a terrifying vacuum at the very center of imperial power. You had an isolated ruling class, a starving population, and a dying child. It was the perfect, highly vulnerable environment waiting for anyone who could offer a miracle. Grigory Rasputin emerged from the frozen silence of Siberia, a peasant who walked thousands of miles to the capital in 1905, carrying with him a promise of spiritual salvation. When he managed to seemingly stop the young heir's bleeding, Empress Alexandra saw him as a living saint. His presence bypassed every rigid, formal hierarchy of the Russian court. His influence was built on a deeply contradictory theology. Rasputin preached that a person had to sin heavily, to dive into the mud, before they could ever achieve genuine repentance. By operating entirely within this moral gray area, he made himself indispensable. He manipulated the royal family's devotion to secure unchecked influence over major military and state decisions. While the empress viewed him as a divine protector, the Russian public looked at the palace and saw a parasite feeding on a decaying monarchy. He didn't execute some brilliant political strategy. He simply monopolized the royal family's deepest fears for their son and their highest hopes for his survival. By the winter of 1916, the Russian elite were in a full panic. They watched this outsider dictating policy and realized the empire was teetering on the edge of total collapse. They convinced themselves that Rasputin was the sole source of the rot. Their logic was dangerously simple: cut out the infection and the patient will heal. This led to that chaotic, frantic night in December. The poison, the bullets, the desperate scramble to dump his body in the icy river, to finally erase his shadow from the palace walls. But the aristocrats made a fatal diagnostic error. They assumed that by eliminating the man exploiting the system, they were eliminating the systemic failures themselves. They confused the symptom for the disease. The morning after Rasputin died, the aristocrats waited for the empire to stabilize. That salvation never came. Instead, the anger in the streets boiled over. Within a few short months, the Romanov dynasty was entirely overthrown by the massive societal unrest they had ignored for decades. The violent armed uprising that swept through the country proved that removing one mystic from the palace did absolutely nothing to save the state. Rasputin didn't destroy Russia. He was merely a mirror held up to a dying world, reflecting the sheer desperation of the people in charge of it. We have a habit of looking back through history and hunting for single villains to explain why massive, complex systems fall apart. But the truth is much quieter. When institutions fail and modern science falls short, terrified people will turn to anything for a sense of control. Rasputin was just a man stepping into the void.